Thanksgiving. Thanksgiving, though it's only a few hundred-year holiday in the United States, it's a several thousand-year holiday in the Jewish tradition, which is to always acknowledge the blessings and the gifts in our lives. Which, on one hand, sounds like a simple act, a simple decency, that when a person is blessed, someone does a favor for you, or God does something for you, it's just a common menschlich thing to do, the decency to say acknowledge and say I thank you. Yet, as we shall discuss, there's a lot more profundity to the concept of appreciating our lives and appreciating those that have helped us in our lives, and obviously also being on the receiving end of appreciation for things we've done for others. So, as an opening question, as I sent out the weekly email that we update, the weekly class update email that describes the topic, it's an issue that I deal with very often. It's a question I ask myself, a question I ask many people. A simple 3-word question: do you feel appreciated? Actually, it's 4 words. 4-word question. Do you feel appreciated? Most people, interestingly, may not surprise you, just as you probably feel this way, do not feel appreciated or feel underappreciated. That's the more correct term. Many of us feel that things that where we paid a price and we've directly helped some individuals, whether it's family members or strangers or colleagues, were never fully acknowledged or appreciated. Some of us feel taken for granted, and some of us even feel abused, often by people we feel we've helped. And of course, the more difficult question to answer is: are you also guilty of the other way around, of not appreciating others? Because if we're the only ones that are like so-called the victims, and someone's not doing the appreciating, are we also part of the problem? That's the question. So it's an interesting question to think about, whether the people in your life that have come around and in one way or other helped you, whether you've really expressed appreciation, whether you feel appreciation, and so on. So when we are told in the Judaism, we say thank you, for example, simple, someone serves you food at the table. So there's an expression in the Talmud that says, which in Aramaic means the wine belongs to the owner, but the tivusa, the thank you, has to go to the waiter. Because you could argue, what's the way? The waiter is just serving me. He didn't produce the wine. He didn't manufacture the food. All he's doing is delivering it from the kitchen to the table. But the fact is, he's the one that's serving you, so he deserves a thank you, even though you can claim that you're thanking God for the actual gift of food. Which simply means that no matter who it is, even if it's someone that's just an intermediary, or like a waiter, or a interface, or any other type of translator, so to speak, that delivers the mail to you, deserves a thank you because they did a service. But what really lies behind it, besides the common decency, as I mentioned, everyone understands, you say thank you, it's a normal thing to do. And people should thank us for something we've done. But there's something deeper here, which also, of course, addresses the bigger question: why is it that so many of us feel underappreciated? In other words, why do so many people lack the basic courtesy of thanking us and appreciating or valuing us in our lives? And this can be either loved ones and family members, this can be, as I said, strangers, it can be co-workers, employees, employers. I mean, the list goes on. So it really touches upon a deeper issue about, we'll call it, lack of a better word, narcissism, selfishness. Obviously a person who's very self-consumed has less time to thank people than someone who isn't. Which means if everything is about me, so that doesn't mean that some of us have the etiquette and the decency to thank, and we'll also thank people, especially if we benefit from it. Someone benefits. But that type of sensitivity to other human beings, the value, the validation to give another person, I would submit, is very much predicated, and you can even say proportionate, to how self-absorbed we are. The more self-absorbed we are, the less we're going to really be sensitive to other people. The less we'll recognize the need to be sensitive, unless, of course, it serves us and our selfish needs. So this so-called malady of people not being appreciated and not appreciating is linked far more to who we are and what drives our lives and what is really the driving engine of a person's psyche and soul. Now, psychologists and philosophers from the beginning of time have debated this issue, whether we are fundamentally selfish human beings or not. Because a very strong case can be made that we are. We see it from the moment the child is born, especially in an early age. A child only knows about its needs. It cries when it's hungry, when it's in pain, when it's tired, when it's not feeling well. There's no courtesy. There's no such thing as a child saying, oh, you know what, my mother's tired, or maybe I should hold that back. A child just naturally cries out. Now, of course, that doesn't mean a child is in any way guilty of that. That's the way a child is created. It's not like choice. But one could argue that that type of attitude remains with us throughout our lifetimes, because we're essentially self-interest-oriented people, meaning everything orbits around me and my needs. And therefore, all we can really be expected of us is that we should somewhat temper it, somewhat not be raw, hardcore narcissists, but to live and let live, so to speak. So we create our so-called superimposed rules that allow us to coexist, which sounds like a decent thing to do. And some cynics will even say that that's superimposed. It's not really natural to us. So that's a big question, because if we are fundamentally selfish creatures, Richard Dawkins wrote his classic book. Richard Dawkins, of course, the radical atheist. The title of the book was The Selfish Gene. That word, the selfish gene, making the case that genes are selfish. All they're driven by is the cardinal rule of existence, which is survival, preservation, self-preservation, and which, of course, is the ruling principle of all evolution and natural selection. That every creature and every life form has one rule, the most important rule of all, is to survive, and hence the principle of survival of the fittest, which is those that are most fit, most powerful, most ingenious, most cunning, will be the ones that survive. And the competition between different organisms and between different life forms, all fighting for limited resources. This is a common principle. This is a given, an axiom in today's science. So, applying this to human beings, we're also part of the creatures of this world, so we too are driven by the selfish gene. And he makes the case, as do other scientists, how we just look at how genes multiply, how cells grow, and you see that it's all about they do whatever it takes for them to survive. Which of course leads us to the moral question: can you really blame somebody for being selfish then? Can you really prosecute someone for being selfish? So we don't really have a complete answer, but the answer usually given is, listen, selfishness is inherent in us. What you could do is, you could call it a crime if your selfishness spills over to the point that you actually hurt another person, whether it's violence or theft or murder or any other form of abuse. That is unacceptable. But if you really think about it, you could ask a skeptical question: why is anyone really blamed? We don't blame predators in the wild for hunting prey, for hunting down the weak. That's part of the natural balance. Why is it with us humans we expect more? So the general answer, the conventional answer, is because we have no choice, or else we'll just destroy ourselves through war and through battles if we don't have some type of common red lights and green lights. But there's nothing inherent in these laws. Well, as antithetical to that, as the ultimate diametric opposite to this approach, of course, is the Torah approach. The Torah approach, from the beginning of the Bible, from the beginning of the Torah, and the whole basis of Judaism, is based on a principle that we are not fundamentally selfish. Period. We are fundamentally created in the divine image. And therefore, that means that we are fundamentally actually selfless people. People who will search for transcendence, to search to get beyond ourselves and put ourselves aside in serving a higher cause. Putting ourselves aside and loving another. So love, transcendence, service is far more inherent to the human condition than is selfishness. That's basic Jewish principle. However, part of the purpose of existence is that there be a battle. So we have another voice inside of us, which is the selfish voice. So we have a selfish gene and we have an unselfish gene, basically. And they're at war. They're at each other's throats. And that is the battle that defines our entire life. How will you behave in every given moment? Will it be following the selfish gene within you, or will it follow the selfless one, the transcendent one? And the more powerful one is obviously the inherent one, but the selfish one is put in there in order to create this type of like equal balance with the objective of us overcoming the challenges of self-absorption and becoming selfless creatures. That doesn't mean that we are compromising our needs and compromising our identities or annihilating ourselves. It means that we become greater people, not when we take, but when we give. This is basic Jewish principle. So when you think about Thanksgiving in that context, there's of course the superficial element of Thanksgiving, besides the Macy's Days Parade and the balloons and the sales. There's the element of thanking. But there's a deeper element. It really means when you're really a person that's thankful for everything that comes your way, you're not just being a nice person, you're actually acknowledging that it's not all about me. There's a sensitivity to a bigger picture. You are blessed to be put on this earth. You're blessed to be given life. Everything that came your way is a gift, and never take for granted that you just deserve it all. A sense of entitlement. So it cuts much more into the heart, into the core of what makes us human beings. Now, that's just a so small introduction, so to speak, to discuss a little more in depth. And of course, why do we have to go more in depth? What's wrong with what I've said till now? Isn't that deep enough? Some may wonder. Well, the reason we have to go more in depth is because it's all easier said than done. It's all nice, everything I've said, everyone could agree with, at least to much of what I've said. And if you don't agree, obviously feel free to rebut this either in an email or in any other way you'd like to communicate. But the reason that this needs a little more discussion is because, as I said, it's easier said than done. Well, if it's that simple, why don't we just turn on the switch of the selfless switch and become more divine and transcendent, and therefore become more sensitive and giving and appreciating, etc. Because it's not that simple. The battle is strong, and we are, in most cases, our own worst enemy. So the question is, what makes it difficult for us to embrace and to grow and improve our lives? Why is it that we find relationships difficult? We find validation in this world difficult. We find, whether we're on the receiving end or on the giving end, all the issues I mentioned before about appreciation. Why is it that difficult? So, of course, one of the basic answers for this is because we're insecure people. In addition to the fact that we're selfish, we could be selfish, we also are insecure. So you combine selfishness and insecurity, you get yourself a very volatile combination, becomes increasingly difficult to get beyond. Some will even argue that we're not really selfish, we're insecure, and therefore we become selfish. If, for example, a person has to fight all their lives for recognition, or for their piece of bread, or for a piece of turf, obviously they're going to become very clingy and needy, and when they finally have something, are not easily to give it up. So you could argue that basically the concept of existential insecurity in our lives, that we, as we grow older, we realize that there's no one really going to take care of us. Even people that love us don't always know how to love us, or not always around, that we become increasingly self-reliant, and self-reliance borders on really just protecting yourself. And when you're busy protecting yourself, you become more blind to other people and to their needs. And with a good argument saying, listen, I've got my needs, your problems are your problems, they're not my problems. Who's going to take care of me if I take care of you, so to speak? So one could strongly argue that in a world like ours, which is a cruel world, a hostile world, and some of us have suffered more than others, but everybody in some way has been impacted by other people's selfishness, that we then in turn become ourselves very much self-reliant and thus more insulated and less sensitive to other human beings. Therefore, we need to discuss this a little more and really come to some type of suggestions and advice which is really what the Torah is, not just to analyze the problem, but to give us suggestions, solutions, of how a person can actually become more in touch with themselves, more secure with themselves. Because that, to go back to appreciation and the idea of being valued, what it touches on is another fundamental issue, which is the dignity of a human being. From a Torah perspective, besides following the axiom I mentioned before, that we're fundamentally divine creatures with the capacity and the need for transcendence and love, and putting ourselves aside actually to seek something greater, a second axiom grows out of that axiom. A second corollary would be the right expression, and that is that each of us has an inherent dignity. Using the model that I mentioned before by contrast, that's called the evolutionary model of the selfish gene, one can make a strong argument that the reason that every organism is so busy with preservation, self-preservation, and survival, is because it doesn't feel secure. It knows if it doesn't kill, it will be killed, basically. So in a world like that, we develop a very strong need of constantly being vigilant and being aggressive, because if not, we may be killed. Which is, of course, a type of, it's quite sad to consider that creatures on this earth basically walk around, whether they show it or not, constantly in fear. Because that's what it means. It's fear. It's fear of death. It's fear of annihilation. And thus, survival becomes the simple driving force. But imagine for a moment, it's always good to do these mind exercises, even if we're not there, to dream and imagine. Imagine if every creature on this earth was absolutely secure with its value. It knows that it has value no matter what happens. And no one can take that away from you because no one has given it to you, only God. And you have nothing to be afraid of because you will always exist as a result of that value. In other words, your preservation is not based on whether you kill all your enemies or not. You have value. To put it in a little more subtle terms, psychologically speaking, you find people that always need to make sure, for them to be right, everyone else has to be wrong. You ever see people in any type of discussion or argument, they're always busy showing how everybody else is wrong. Now, a very secure person who has a good position and a strong position, intellectual position, doesn't have to necessarily show how others are wrong. All you got to do is make a case for what you believe in and then feel secure and confident in it. Why do you have to knock everybody else? Knocking others is the first sign, whether people are aware how transparent they are when they do it or not is another story, but it's the first sign of a person that's very insecure. Because they cannot coexist. You have to be wrong for me to be right. Think about that. Which means, essentially, that we're driven by a fundamental insecure state of mind, state of being, when in truth, if you really do have an inherent value, and you're not aware of it, it's quite tragic. It means you're not aware of the thing that is the most important thing, that you deserve value, you deserve to be appreciated. The fact that nobody appreciates you should not in any way weaken your confidence. Now, this doesn't justify or in any way minimize the pain if somebody does not say thank you. But I can tell you many people who feel underappreciated, even though they may be right, but they're also wrong. What do I mean by that? They're right that other people should have said thank you, but the reason they dwell on it, and it becomes such a painful thorn, is because they suffer from insecurity themselves and are constantly dwelling when I don't feel appreciated. And the real goal is not to get everybody around you to say thank you, it's to get you to be in a place where you don't need to be dependent on it. That other people have to be appreciative is absolutely necessary. But that you should be dependent on other people's valuing you or not is itself a sad commentary. So a major part of really studying Torah, a major part of really embracing what God wants of us, and I would say maybe the greatest gift that God has given us, and that God itself, the concept of God gives us, is that we have inherent value. And nothing takes that away. Our stocks don't go up or down based on other people's whims and moods. Our value is not based on performance, on our performance, on buying power, on looks, on youth, on equity, on all the other status symbols that people consider to be so important. Your value is based on you and your soul. The mere fact that you exist means that you have inherent value. Which is why we need more discussion. How do you connect to that part of yourself when we're constantly being bombarded and inundated with messages that invalidate us? And not to sound like a fire and brimstone here, but the fact of the matter is, basically we are inundated, especially in our information age, advertising, whether it's on television, radio, internet, all forms of streaming media, texting. I'm not going to go through the whole list, but there's constantly messages coming to us, and those messages, in most cases, are trying to sell us something. Which really means, if you think about it psychologically, it's telling you that you're not complete without this thing, and therefore you should buy it. You're not beautiful enough, you're not driving the right car, you're not hanging around the right places, you're not traveling the right, etc., etc. That's what it is. Now, I'm not suggesting every product is valueless. Some of these products are valuable, but a lot of them are not necessarily something you need. So we're inundated. Statistics say by the time we're 20 years old, an average American has seen 1 million advertisements. Seen or read or heard 1 million advertisements. That's an awful lot of messages. You have to wonder what 1 million messages what that does to our being, our psyches. And the question is, do we have 1 million counter messages that are telling us that you are inherently valuable? I would submit not really. But that's the message. The message is that if you don't do this, you don't do that. And the message comes to us, besides the media, from society itself. The people we meet, the parties we go to. Happy Thanksgiving, Rabbi and Rabbis.
Thank you so much.
There you go.
All of you too.
Yes.
You have much to be thankful for.
Amen. This is our host, so I'm thanking Rabbi Metzger and Rebbetzin Metzger. He's the Chabad of Midtown. Magil. Anyway, so society and all its pressures, and wherever we go, there's what do you look like? How you dressed? Do you fit in? Don't you fit in? Style. You name the whole list. The list goes on. Which perhaps is why the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, begins with the following statement. Before any laws are stated, it states with a principle, a piece of advice. The advice says, Al yevush mipnei habaligim. Do not be embarrassed for those that will mock you. It's the opening statement in all Code of Jewish Law. Which really means, do not be affected by others, basically. You are valuable because you're valuable. And find out what your value is, and hold on to it for your dear life. Because not others can define who you are, in other words, not others should define who you are. You shouldn't be busy with your entire life trying to satisfy or make somebody else happy. You have inherent value. This, to me, is more than any other thing what makes the Torah unique, what makes God unique. Because without this statement, everything else becomes arbitrary. How valuable, how indispensable could your investments be? Could your time be? Could all your involvements be if you're dispensable? So it all comes down to your own inherent value, which we are all is our birthright. It's our God-given birthright. And actually, the founding fathers of the United States, though Thanksgiving is a little earlier than that, but they stated in the Declaration of Independence in their own words. They call it all men are created equal. Say all people are created equal. And all have inalienable rights endowed upon them by the Creator. That's the words of the Declaration of Independence. The Creator is used. Created equal and by the Creator. Why? Because they understood, even though they were deists, and they were not advocating a religion, mixing it with the state, yet they understood that the foundation of a true democracy, of true freedom, is that there has to be some unwavering foundation, unwavering principle that nobody can change, that guarantees everybody inherent value in the pursuit of happiness and the freedom of speech and the other expressions of freedom that the Bill of Rights guarantees. Because if you leave it up to human beings can say, you know what, there's some more equal than others. So it had to be something that was divine. And they put it into the Declaration of Independence, so no one can come and no majority can vote, can change that. Because it wasn't decided by a majority. It was decided by the Creator. And this they saw not as a religious statement, they saw it as a moral statement, as a fundamental principle a constitutional principle that is the foundation of this country, actually. Nobody could ever change that. So that even guarantees the right for a person to choose not to be an atheist, to be a non-believer. Because the dignity of every person's inalienable rights includes the right to deny God, but never the right to deny other people's rights. So this principle is the foundation of the entire Torah. That's how it begins. So when you think of it that way, then the question and challenge is, so what happened? Why then are we such insecure creatures? Why don't we just feel this inherent value? And how different would our lives be if we were driven from that type of, jealousy, hatred, anger, carrying grudges, being consumed with what other people tell you or don't tell you, would all disappear if you felt every second that you just have inherent value that's gushing from within your soul, and who really cares what other people are saying or not saying? But we're not that way. We are social animals, and we are impacted all the time. So that's why we need a little more discussion, not just to talk, but to really figure out what kind of tools can we access, instruments to reconnect, access that inherent soul within us, which is essentially concealed. So we're born with it, and then it's beaten out of us. As we grow from birth to children and to adults, we become part of a world that teaches us to be insecure because everyone else around us is insecure, and they project it upon us. People lie all the time. Why would a person need to lie? Why? Because they're either ashamed of what they did, or they're insecure with what they did. A person who's completely confident could say, listen, I made a mistake, and I now regret it. I'm just giving you some simple examples. So we have in this week's chapter a very fascinating episode that becomes even more fascinating when you read the discourse in Ayin Beis. And Ayin Beis, as I mentioned many times over this year, is an acronym, really means 72, but it's referring to a treatise, a epic, Hasidic, Kabbalistic, mystical, and spiritual document that was authored and delivered 100 years ago this week. It's actually a series of discourses that began Shavuos, which would be around May 1912. So May 2012, just a few months ago, was the beginning of that centennial. To honor it, I began teaching it. I teach it every morning, and there's a whole YouTube channel dedicated and a website, a wiki spaces website dedicated called Ayin Beis. It's pretty heavy stuff. I teach it in text, but it's if you're interested in a nice journey into the beyond, just taste it. So every morning I give a class, and then we post it on YouTube. So YouTube is now being inundated with Ayin Beis. Doing a little inundation. I'm trying to reach 1 million messages by the time you're age 20 with Ayin Beis. That will counter the 1 million advertising messages. I don't know if we'll get there, but I'm working on it. So this Ayin Beis, as I said, is a flowing discourse, a series of discourses, and continues as well this week. And this week, Pasha, the chapter we're reading, Vayetze, Vayishlach next week, the Ayin Beis addresses a very cryptic and puzzling episode here at the end of the chapter that we're reading this Shabbos this week, and it explains it, as I said, in the most fascinating way. And I'll try to do justice by summing it up. But first, the story in the Bible itself. And as we always know, the principle I always base this on is, as I said earlier, the Torah means the word Torah comes from the word directive. It's like a blueprint for life. Essentially, it's a relevant message to us today. So even though the episodes and the narratives and the characters lived and played out their lives thousands of years ago in a different part of the world, actually it's a part of the world that is right now going through its own upheavals, the Middle East. So we have here the story that even though it happened back then, its relevance today is as relevant today as it ever has been, as we shall see. So there's the technical story, and then we'll talk about some questions, and then it's ultimately the spiritual, psychological, and emotional and personal meaning. So the story begins as the chapter begins, Vayetze. If you're familiar with the Torah's general story narrative, you know the book of Genesis, which we are now in, which we began reading after Simchas Torah, the end of the holiday season, the beginning of the Jewish year. So it goes in chronological order. It begins with Bereshit, Genesis, the beginning of creation. And these chapters continues the chronological order after the first 10 generations from Adam to Noah, next 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. Then it slows down and begins to talk about each of these individuals. First, Abraham, who in a pagan world, in a dark world, finds light. He basically is the father of monotheism, discovers God in a dark world. In turn, he had a son called Isaac, and his story is told in the previous chapters. And Isaac, in turn, had two sons that I discussed last week. Eila told us Yitzchak, the two sons, the twins, Esav and Jacob. And the end of last week's chapter is the whole story how Esav is in fiery rage, murderous rage, wants to kill his brother Jacob. As a result, and Jacob also at the same time also was of age to find a bride for himself, get married, find his soulmate. So his parents, Isaac and Rebekah, tell him to go to Haran. Haran is a city where Abraham actually originated from, somewhere southeast of modern-day Iraq. And the chapter begins, this week's chapter, Vayetze Yaakov miBeersheva. Jacob leaves Beersheba. Beersheba is a city in Jerusalem, in the Negev. And Beersheba is where Isaac lived and where Abraham had lived. This was their hometown in Israel. And he goes Vayelech Haran, and he goes on a journey, basically southeast, a journey to Haran. And the famous story of Jacob falling asleep in the beginning of the journey and having the classic dream, the famous dream of the ladder, Jacob's ladder, where God comes to him and promises him that he will protect him, that he will build a family, and he will return in peace to his homeland, to the home of his parents, which means Israel. As a result, Jacob wakes up, realizes that he's in a holy ground, sacred ground, and Jacob, talk about Thanksgiving, he thanks God. He actually takes the stone upon which he rested, where he slept on a stone beneath his head. He makes a marker. This is very important to the whole story. He makes a marker called a matzeva. He anoints the stone. He pours oil on it. It's a type of offering, thanking God for his promises. And with that, he embarks on his continuing journey, and he ends up in Haran. In Haran, I'm not going to go through all the details, but basically in Haran he meets first Rachel, who he falls in love with, and then approaches her father Laban, who's his uncle, who's Jacob's uncle. Laban was a brother of Jacob's mother, Rebekah, and he asks permission to marry his daughter Rachel. So Laban, as we find out quickly, is a cunning, shrewd, corrupt, smart businessman, and he says to him, yes, if you tend to my sheep, be a shepherd, which was his basic living, his income. He was a shepherd. You tend to my sheep, and he had thousands of sheep for 7 years. With that, you will earn your right to my daughter Rachel. Well, Jacob does that. He works for 7 years, and then Laban fools him, and instead of bringing Rachel to the chuppah, he brings Leah, her sister, which is first deception. Maybe not the first, maybe the second. Anyway, like a long story short, he ends up working another 7 years for Rachel. It ends up the whole story. He's busy tending to Laban's sheep. He makes Laban very wealthy. Jacob himself is also majorly successful. There's a whole story of how he actually breeds the sheep and creates different types of sheep of different spots and stripes. There's a whole episode about that. And finally, after 20 years of being by Laban, and at this point Jacob had also had all his children except one, Benjamin, the last of the 12 tribes, would be born in Israel later. All 11 boys and one girl, Dinah, all the tribes, basically the foundation of the nation of Israel, our ancestors were all born in Haran, of all places. And after 20 years, Jacob finally decides, time to go back home. He knows Laban is not going to make it easy for him, because Laban always had another trick up his sleeve. So one night, he packs up everybody, his family and so on, and makes off. When Laban sees that his son-in-law with his daughters and the families escape, he pursues them, And this is how the story ends. And after pursuing them, he comes with a complaint. I love my children. I love my grandchildren. Why did you run away with them all? I wanted to say goodbye to them. Suddenly he's all this lovey-dovey, beautiful stuff. But the truth is that he had other intentions in mind. But the bottom line is, first he claims and says to Jacob, and you have nothing of your own. Everything you took is all mine. It's my children, it's my family, it's my sheep, everything. Your wealth is mine. Well, Jacob insists that he's not going to go back. So they finally come to an agreement, and this is what I want to stop on. The end of this chapter, literally the end, where Laban and Jacob make a covenant. And this is what it says in the Torah. It says like this. We'll make a covenant, a witness between us. And Jacob took an evan, a stone, just like he had done before he started his journey, or after the dream. He took a stone and he established a matseva, which means a marker. Just look at how this is translated. Monument, pillar. And then he said to Laban and his people, he said, now you take stones and you make a marker. Instead of making a marker, they built a mound, like a pile of stones. And they used this as a symbol of a barrier, a boundary between Laban and Jacob. He said, okay, this will be a boundary between Israel and outside of Israel. You, Laban says, I will not cross over this boundary to hurt you in any way. And Jacob's, and you do not cross over to my part of the land. And that will be our agreement. And he repeats it several times. It's like a whole story, it's like a whole episode, this whole mound thing. And then after this agreement is reached, Jacob, it says, continues on his way, and the chapter concludes with Jacob going on his way, being greeted by angels, divine angels, and finally comes back to Israel. That's the end of the story. Now, I know there are some uncanny similarities to things going on today. If the boundaries like this would be maintained, we wouldn't have the problems we have today. And it's also interesting, as an aside, the parallels. Haran means wrath. That's what the Hebrew word Haran means. Be'er Sheva, the place that Jacob left, means the fountain of seven. So the commentaries explain that the story of Jacob is the story of each of our lives. The soul's descent to earth is leaving the fountain of seven. These are the seven divine emotions and attributes of the spheres. And they come down to a place of wrath. I mentioned before, it's a difficult world. It's a cruel world. Being that I have a little mischievous side, I couldn't ignore the similarity of the word Haran to the word Hamas. So I decided to do a little research. What's the word Hamas mean? Because I know Hamas in Hebrew what it means. Hamas in Hebrew means violence. Mola earth Hamas. We learned earlier in the chapter about the flood that the earth was filled with corruption and violence. So I looked up what does it mean in Arabic. What does Hamas mean in Arabic? Arabic and Hebrew have a lot of similarities, and they come from the same root. So is Hamas the same thing? Would they call themselves violent? Now, obviously, I don't know Arabic, so I can't really know, but it's shrouded in mystery. And I found a bunch of translations. Hamas is translated as fire, fanaticism, as zeal. But I think in more politically corrupt websites, they've blunted it a bit, and they call it enthusiasm. Check it out. I did just do a little Googling. But when I looked at, the original Arabic, it's much closer to zeal and fire than it is to enthusiasm. Enthusiasm sounds to me more like an American marketing word. Enthusiastic, zeal. And it's also an acronym for the Islamic resistant movement in Arabic. But I cannot help ignore, as I said, the similarities. Because when you look at their charter, they call for violence. A violent jihad against Israel. And that's why they call for the entire annihilation of Israel, not just part of it. Everything is occupied, Tel Aviv and Jerusalem too. So it's hard to ignore this, that in their charter it says violent, and they're called Hamas. I don't know if exactly that's the name of it, but Haran and wrath and Hamas sound awfully similar. And interesting, Laban, we read in the Haggadah, we say that Laban wanted to destroy the entire Jewish nation, not like Pharaoh. Pharaoh only wanted to kill the Jewish boys, the males. Laban wanted to destroy them all. And that's exactly what it says in the Hamas charter. Anyway, I'm just pointing out some interesting parallels. Now, let's go back to the actual story. So as I said, the descent into Haran, into a world of wrath, is the descent of every soul in this dark world. A soul, as I mentioned before, by inherently is a divine power. It's secure, it's confident, it is a piece of the God, divine. It's indispensable. But it comes into a world that conceals that divine energy. And that's why we call this a world of wrath. This doesn't mean that we have wrath all the time, but we have potential wrath. Well, it's a world of a lot of anger, a lot of hostility, a lot of cruelty, a lot of selfishness. And this is the story of Jacob coming into Haran. And that's why he was afraid. He was terrified. What will happen? He's left his homeland, Israel, the holy place where he lived, Be'er Sheva, spiritual environment, and he's coming into this difficult world. So God promises him right at the beginning of the chapter and says to him, don't be afraid. I'm with you. Not only will you survive, but you'll thrive there. He says to him the famous blessing, you'll have your children, and you will build a nation, and the nation will spread out. Yom HaVakedma, which means east and west, north and south, everywhere in the world. Not immediately, but over time. Now, just to drive the point home, here we are 3,500 years later, and the promise was fulfilled. There are Jews everywhere, east, west, south, and north, to some people's chagrin. But we're everywhere. And so the promise God made to Jacob was fulfilled. And he promises him, I will be with you, I will protect you, even in this dark world. Which is really the message to all of us. No matter how challenging, how dark this world is, we have God with us. You were sent here. No one's here by accident. You were sent on a mission. And like in any mission, it does have challenges, but every challenge comes with strengths. Unique strengths to face that challenge, which again is a fundamental principle in Judaism. Just like it's fundamental and inherent that each of us is a indispensable divine force, and that each of us therefore should have the confidence in that. There's another principle that you have all the strengths you need to face any challenge, and there's nothing to be afraid, essentially, fundamentally. That is what God promises Jacob and promises each of us. So when Jacob hears this, he wants to thank God for this promise. He acknowledges it he erects a little matzeva, takes the stone that he slept on, his pillow basically, and makes a little monument, just a stone, a marker, says, this is a symbol of my thanking you. What's the meaning of this stone? So, on a very basic level, it's a symbolic thing. But on a deeper level, the stone symbolizes the material world. A physical stone. He didn't just say a prayer. He could have said a prayer to God. We say, Modani, I thank you. Acknowledge. He didn't just say a prayer. It's a sign of taking the material world and actually elevating it and directing it to be a monument to God, which is really the essence of all mitzvahs. For example, when the Jews come into Israel, what's the first mitzvah? That it says when you come to Israel, the mitzvah of Bikurim, the first fruit that you will grow, that you will harvest, give the first fruit to God. Not just say a prayer. We actually give the first fruit because we're acknowledging the blessings in a physical way. You gave us physical blessings, and we return a physical gift. This is why we give charity. This is why we help others. We don't just say thank you, we also help by demonstrating that we really appreciate it in a very real, tangible, concrete way, actionable way. And then begins the story. He meets Rachel and the whole story. I'm not going to go through all the details. I have discussed it in previous years. I'm going to cut to the end of the 20 years, to the end of the chapter. And he builds, and what God promised happened. Jacob thrives, builds a large family, beautiful family. He thrives materially, spiritually. It's difficult. Jacob will later say to Laban, 20 years you've made me suffer. But the results were beautiful results. So very painstaking, heart-wrenching years. But Jacob does make it. And then comes the day where he's ready to move on, and now of course, the reason he was able to make it that way is because, in a sense, if he had stayed in Beersheba and he'd stayed in a spiritual environment without the challenges, it may have been more comfortable, but it would not have been as gratifying, would not have been as enriching. Because a big principle in the entire purpose of existence is that darkness brings out deeper light. That pressure brings the best out of us. So one of the reasons the soul is sent to this world, the reason that we have challenges in the first place, is because it's like an obstruction, like a dam. You build a dam, and after a while, the water builds up, and its intensity is far greater than if there was no resistance in the first place. You show me success. Show me any successful thing, you will see there's always preceded by resistance. It's always preceded by some type of block. So the block, nobody wants the block, nobody wants that type of frustration or the pain or the challenges, but every birth is preceded by some type of resistance. The Baal Shem Tov puts it this way, there's in Yiddish, you know how you say in Yiddish, a spiral staircase. A spiral staircase in Yiddish is called Schwindeltreppe. Treppe in Yiddish is steps. And Schwindel, you know what Schwindel means? Swindler. Swindling steps. They're called swindling steps, like a swindler, like a thief. Why? Because when you walk up a regular staircase, you see your destination. It may be many steps, but it's direct. A spiral staircase swindles you into thinking you're not going anywhere. Because every time you make a complete turn, you don't see the destination. So you could be staying right before the apex, the top of your destination, and your whole body is turned 180 degrees, and you have no idea that that's the destination. Which is what challenges do. Sometimes the darkest moments are. Sometimes the darkest moment is the darkness before the dawn, the breakthrough, and sometimes we don't see it through. So the challenges are meant to bring out the best of us, not meant to torture us, meant to bring the best. So Jacob's success is predicated specifically in Haran. In a place of wrath, that's where he shined, because he rose to the occasion. And you see the story later when the Jews are in Egypt. So it says the more they were oppressed by Pharaoh and the Egyptians, the more they multiplied, the more they grew. Because that's what healthy, strong people do. Nothing can put them down. There's a challenge, they figure out how to dig deeper, and they become better swimmers. They become more powerful. Now, this is not a justification for anyone ever having to suffer any pain. This is after the fact, to know that you are indomitable, meaning you're indispensable. Nothing can destroy you. So if something comes your way that's difficult, you have all the strengths to face it, and you become a stronger person as a result. Now, God should bless everyone. We should have the minimal amount of aggravation and pain. But should we have some wrath in our lives? Haran, the story of Jacob teaches us how we become far greater. And this is really the story of the Jewish people. Our greatness today is a direct result of our suffering. Nothing can destroy us, because we have learned strength, developed strength, because we faced the abyss so many times. Thank God today we don't have to deal with that. Unfortunately, in Israel there's still plenty of problems, ceasefire or not. It's just a ticking time bomb, as we all know. And of course our hearts and prayers go out to everyone there, especially those that suffered today, wounded in the bus bombing in Tel Aviv. And hopefully the boundary will hold, and there won't be any more attacks. But more importantly, I hope that they do what they have to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. Let's put it that way. But to go back to the story here again, so now comes the end of the story. Jacob is now successful, he has built his family, he's going back. But Laban has still something to say, which tells us that it's like this, he takes his final curtain call. But Laban also has got his strengths. So what is the story here at the end, where Laban pursues him, and more importantly, they build this matzeva, this marker, and then this mound? What's the meaning? Why would the Torah elaborate? How many verses are just about this? 1, 2, 3. Basically a good 10 verses. Talk all about this covenant with the mound and so on. What relevance does it make? Whether it's a mound or not a mound? Well, 9 Bays, as I said, this week's discourse that was delivered 100 years ago, unbelievable explanation, all of this. After the introductions I've given, we can understand the explanation. But I'm going to go a little into some little Kabbalistic, mystical ideas. It will hopefully won't be cryptic. I'll try to explain it in palatable terms. So as I said, the story of Jacob and Haran is the story of each of our lives. A soul trapped or sent and in a wrathful, dark Haran world with Hamas and other powerful forces that challenge us all the time. Each of us has our Haran that we deal with. Think of the darkest moments, think of the challenges, think of all the different challenges. But not only are we sent to a place of Haran, we also deal with people of Haran. Laban represents the corrupt individual. Basically the antithesis to Jacob. Jacob is Ish Tam Yoshev Aholim. He's the innocent scholar. Straight integrity. And he has now his uncle Laban, who he has to deal with. So besides the Haran itself, the city of wrath, he's dealing with a person that's not such to say that he's not easy is mild. To put it mild, he's a corrupt liar, basically. And Jacob has to deal. He's at his mercy. So as I said, Jacob is not perturbed. He does his thing quietly makes his way, builds his family, he takes the abuse, but he does not become a victim. He becomes a great man, because he doesn't become Laban's lackey or Laban's slave. He builds his family, becomes wealthy, figures out how to do it, and then makes his way on. But there's a Laban in every one of our lives that's a force, either a voice within us, that is this voice of the cynic or the voice of the darkness. So we have the Jacob within us and we have the Laban within us, and there's a battle going on. Now, Laban had no clue. He underestimated Jacob. He had no idea. He thought he could keep him under control. Listen, he's blackmailing him for his daughters. He has them there. Jacob has no family to go to. He has nowhere to run. He has no refuge. The sheep are owned by Laban. So he thought he's it all figured out, but he realized it's not so simple. Jacob is a lot more to him than he estimated. He thought he was a little innocent Jew coming from Israel, dependent. He ends up being a powerhouse. So Laban realizes that Jacob is actually a big threat. He's a big threat. What it means in spiritual terms is that God created the universe, what he calls Zelu Umazeh Asalakim. Created two parallel universes. For everything that is created in the world of light, there's a parallel in the world of darkness. It's real parallel. And they're at war with each other. Just like on a chessboard. You have the black pieces, you have the white pieces. They're exactly equal. And each wants to conquer the other. It's very similar to what we learned last week about Esau and Jacob, the twins, who are also at each other's throats. So it's not a coincidence that this story will lead us next chapter into Jacob dealing with Esau. But first he has to deal with Laban. So Laban represents the forces that oppose who you are. In other words, going back to the original theme of this discussion here, if your birthright is inherent value, indispensability, self-confidence, Laban is the force that tries to weaken that all the time. It's the voice inside each of us that tells us we're worthless, don't think you're so special, nobody cares about you, take care of yourself because no one else will take care of you. That whole narcissistic, selfish approach. It's about self-absorption. Jacob is the voice of selflessness, of service. And initially, the negative forces feel very confident because they think they have the holy forces, the good light under control. Then suddenly the dark forces realize that this light is more powerful under the radar. Jacob did a lot more than he ever thought possible. So now Laban is not going to let this go down easily. So he pursues him and insists. He says, everything you have belongs to me. I gave you your job, I gave you your family, and everything. Well, Jacob is not going to take that easily, and Jacob says, well, I'm still moving on. I don't really care what you have to say. So Laban is he builds a mound. What is the symbolism of the mound? So here's the Kabbalistic concept. In the spiritual worlds, between light and darkness, how does it work? Where the divine light, or so-called where truth prevails, there's no room for something that's untruthful. If you're in the presence of greatness, if you're in the presence of beauty, there's no room for something that's ugly. So the Kabbalists asked the big question that Arizal says, so how do we have a world of ugliness? Where did it come from? How is it possible, when there was once total divine unity prevailed, how can we live in a world that is so fragmented, that's so divided? If fundamentally Hashem Echad, as we say in the Shema, if fundamentally the divine energy is all oneness, why is it that we can hurt each other? Or to use the example from the Talmud says, based on Avos, to love your fellow as yourself. You know why? Because we're all parts of one organism. Is it conceivable that the right hand will hit the left hand? So how is it possible we can hurt each other? And we see wars have been fought, wars are being fought, people hate each other. Whether it's countries and nations or races, whether it's in communities, whether it's in our own homes. How is it possible? So for most of us, we don't have this question because we grew up, this is our status quo. De facto, we live in a fragmented, selfish world. But the Kabbalists are worried, how did it get here in the first place? There was only one God. There are no two gods, God forbid. So there's no duality. There's no duality. How did not just diversity, but this divisiveness emerge? So the Holy Arizal says, explains it with the mystical concept of the tzimtzum, which I've discussed many times. The tzimtzum is a conceptual concealment. The best example given for it is if you have an infinitely brilliant teacher, for him to be able to, or her, to convey an idea to a finite student requires a major radical jump, a quantum leap. It requires, first of all, a concealment. It's like, imagine you're teaching, just as an example, you're teaching a kindergarten, you're teaching children A, B, C. They have no clue yet how to read. They don't even know how to write a letter. They have no idea these letters one day will be the key to all knowledge. These letters will be combined into words will become sentences will become paragraphs will become books, and ideas and concepts and language, the whole thing. So what do you do when you have to convey a very simple message to someone who's not there yet, doesn't get the whole thing? You have to condense or concentrate or really conceal the brilliance in the teacher's mind, and then you can begin a stream of consciousness like spoon feed and say, okay, let's teach you today A. Tomorrow we will learn B, C, D. So essentially, this is an analogy for what now. And how much more, infinitely more so, is when there's a distance between a divine presence and existence like ours. For us to be an independent reality, that you and I can be sitting in this room right now and feel I'm self-made, I'm not dependent on anything, and feel an independent consciousness. Essentially, this tzimtzum is the key. There's a fundamental concealment that doesn't allow us to sense the connection that we have with each other, the connection we have with our source, with God. But then, as the Kabbalists explain, as the Arizal explains, a thin kav, he calls it a kav, a thin ray of light, is what carries the message into existence, that creates existence. But right now, the main divine presence is concealed. Now, okay, fine, so far so good. But the problem is, since it's all concealed, and for us to emerge is predicated and dependent on concealment, what happens if we misunderstand the concealment? What happens when the concealment becomes too intense? To use an example, God hides His presence like a parent would hide from a child playing hide and go seek, in order to provoke the child to be ingenious enough to find the parent. Now, what happens if we stop looking and we take the concealment seriously? Meaning we forget that it's concealment. It's only meant to be a means to provoke and a means to bring deeper light. This, as the Kabbalists explain, is the source of all our problems. The concealment becomes so intense that we forget that as a concealment. And then what happens is a new reality is created, a reality based on narcissism and selfishness. So the purpose of our being independent entities was in order for us to be wise enough to see through the curtain, so to speak, see and recognize that we're really part of a larger picture and figure out how to connect, which is what Jacob fully understands. And Laban represents the forces of darkness, which become powerful in the absence of good. Because when the light is dominant, a negative force cannot emerge. Think of it this way. When do infections, God forbid, attack? When there's vulnerability. When the person is very healthy and your skin is intact and everything is there, it's very hard for an infection to enter. When there's a vulnerability, there's a wound, an open wound. When there is a lack of sterilization. When there's an environment of, if you open up, turn over a stone where there's in a garden, you'll find all the maggots. Because there's moisture there. But as soon as you shine light, what happens? They all run. Psychologically speaking, the same is true. The forces of darkness thrive in darkness. They do not thrive in clarity. When there's confusion and lack of clarity, that is always the place where the negative forces begin to dwell, including in our own lives. The biggest trouble we get into is when we don't have clarity, when we're bored, when there's a vacuum. The tzimtzum, this concealment, created a vacuum. The purpose of the vacuum, as I said before, was to provoke. The purpose of the wrath is to provoke us to overcome it and become stronger people. But if it's misunderstood, it can become a very vulnerable situation, and that's where Laban thrives. Now, when he saw what Jacob had accomplished, and the power that the soul can transform this world into a divine, holy place, these forces of darkness, the voices inside of us, suddenly muster up a lot of energy. And he builds a mound. The mound, as this Ayin Beis explains, is what is a mound? A stone is just one stone. It's a marker, which is what Jacob did. A mound is literally a block. A mound is a bunch of random stones that basically create a blockage. He wanted a block that the energy between the light and the darkness should be cut off. It's like cutting off the light. In the Kabbalistic terminology, this is called a parsa. A parsa means a curtain, a cloak. So you find in life, we need to have cloaks all the time. In order for there to be a diverse existence, we need to have different departments. We need to have compartmentalization. We need to have a separation, for example, between the windpipe and the food pipe. We need to have a separation between the head and the body. We have separations. We have the difference between the right brain and the left brain. We have compartments, the ventricles and the heart. These compartments are very necessary for us to have a healthy organism. You need compartments. But what happens when the walls between the compartments become airtight and there's no flow between them? That's called a stroke. That's called a heart attack. So the key is to have the right balance, is to have compartments, but not airtight ones, not ones that are so tight that you can't have a flow of life going on. That would be like a blockage that wouldn't allow the circulation to be effective. So that perfect balance of health is where you have both. You have the compartments, but you also have a certain flow between these compartments. The brain is a perfect example for this. Most mental illness is defined today as being a chemical imbalance. What's a chemical imbalance? Chemical imbalance, chemicals that flow in the brain create compartments. What does that mean? That, let's say a person experiences a very serious trauma. The chemicals in the brain will at some point lock that away in a distant memory. If we had the intensity of that shock that we had during the first initial trauma, we'd never be able to survive. If there's a chemical breakdown, what happens is a person can live with a fear that the normal chemicals should have already put back in a closet. This doesn't mean you can't retrieve it, but it means that there's a healthy element of compartmentalization, even forgetfulness. Not everything has to be remembered, especially in the moment of impact. So the chemicals in the brain, basically what they do is they regulate. They say, okay, this memory now, it's time to begin to push it back to long-term memory. Focus on the moment here. This is how we heal from things. If we would carry a grudge exactly like the moment that it happened, that's usually an imbalanced type of life. So that's just as an example. On the other hand, if there's no memories at all, and the compartments become so intense that you cannot recall anything from the past, it's also equally unhealthy. So the way he explains it in Ayin Beis is this channel is what Jacob had a perfect balance. You build a stone, don't build mountains. What are you building a mound for? Let's take relationships as an example. In relationships, a healthy relationship is a combination of a paradox. This itself is a formula that if everybody realized, it would avoid a lot of aggravation. What's the paradox? The paradox is you have two individuals who are distinct. They're born into different families. They didn't know each other. They have different personalities. In many ways, they're very different. They've come to learn to love each other. So what happens now when they loved each other? What happens to these two distinct individuals? Do they cease being distinct? Do they annihilate their individuality? That's a big mistake. Relationships that require annihilation is not a relationship. That means there's something wrong there. On the other hand, if they remain distinct completely, then they're still strangers. So how do you balance closeness, intimacy, oneness with distinction, without one disturbing the other? Clearly, this is a paradox. And the truth is, if you look around in life, every healthy organism has this paradox. Look at your body. What is a healthy body? Not one organ or one limb. You have 75 trillion cells. You have hundreds of different systems. Each one has to function by its rules. The respiratory system should not work like the neurological system. And yet, there's some coordination. There's some type of choreographer that says you're all part of one organism. No one really understands this paradox. Nature works the same way. Completely different entities, but there's a certain balance. The only ones actually that can upset this balance is human beings. Because we can do things that are unnatural and we can upset the natural balance, etc., etc. But there's a balance. Everything fits into that balance. Even when there's a fire, a forest, for example, there's a whole system how a forest regenerates. Some even say that natural disasters are a healthy part of the system. It's only unhealthy and a disaster when we get in the way. There are earthquakes that happen every minute on Earth, and they keep the balance. There are hurricanes, tornadoes, tsunamis. They're all necessary. It only becomes a disaster when human beings happen to be in the path of the... But this is part of the healthy immunity system, like a cleaning system. Hurricanes are like like winds, are like a vacuum cleaner. Without them, if you read the science, this earth would not exist. It's a way of counterbalancing the different forces. Earthquakes as well, volcanoes. As I said, I'm not justifying, of course, the disaster is when we get in the way, when we're living right near on the fault or in the path of a hurricane that just happened here. The point is there's a balance to life. So this balance, it requires a very delicate balance. It's a dance. So when you say love, you really want to have is, if two people are two circles, what you want to have is like that, right? Like two musical notes coming together in one composition. Without one note compromised, they're both part of creating a greater music. How is that possible? That's only possible if both of them understand that it's not about me. That's why in a wedding ceremony, a Jewish wedding ceremony, we have a chuppah. A chuppah is a canopy. It's a transcendent force, something that's more than the sum of the parts. That's the key to maintain the balance. So you have to have, on one hand, boundaries. In any relationship, the expression would go like this. When you're close, when you should be distant, you'll end up being distant when you should be close. It's a quote I use in Torah Meaningful Life in the chapter of love. What does this mean? It means two individuals, even as much as they love each other, they still need their space. They still have unique identities. And there's a time where they have to be in their space. Then there's a time where they become one, and they should be one. And if one is compromised, the other will be compromised. If they're going to be close when they should be each in their distinct space, they're going to end up being in each in their distinct space when they should be close. Learning this dance is the challenge. But the key ingredient in this is not that it's not about me and my needs. When you recognize there's a third partner, there's a higher force, that the marriage itself, the relationship itself is driven for a higher purpose, you find this balance. Jacob understood this balance very well. Laban built this mountain. So as he explains in the Ayin Bey's discourse, he says the mountain is creating this impenetrable boundary. Like, don't you stay there and I'm here. That's not a healthy thing. It's important to have boundaries. But a boundary is also meant to be a place where we can exchange and we can go back and forth. Laban was basically saying the forces of darkness say, we don't want any light here. We want to have our own, we want to dominate here. We don't need you here. Laban, of course, was terrified because he saw what Jacob was able to accomplish. Insecure individuals are terrified of secure individuals, which is why the communists and other totalitarian regimes, who do you think they arrest first? And they put away in labor camps and insane asylums, just to amplify the irony. They put all the thinkers, the writers, the intellectuals, all the people who are, because it's a threat to them. They have no problem with the conformists and the lackeys. They put away anyone that has originality. Because people who are unoriginal or mediocre people are very threatened by secure people. Because it exposes how insecure. If everybody was insecure, you don't feel so insecure. It's like, it's misery loves company type of thing. So Laban, basically, his attitude was, okay, I see what you're capable of. You stay in your domain. Stop elevating sparks. Stop refining my sheep. Stop transforming this world. Darkness wants to have its darkness. In more psychological terms, you could say Laban said, I want my denial. I like it. I'm not interested in being made aware that there's something else going on. Jacob's attitude was, we need our boundaries, but a boundary is a stone. Not more than that. We don't need to create these mounds. I can go on and elaborate about this a little more, especially if you're familiar with the parsa concept in Kabbalah, the parsa, which is those like gaps, those spaces, like I said, the curtains, the veils. So there's a whole discussion in Kabbalistic literature about the veils in existence. William Blake, who some say was a mystic, and he talks about beyond the doors of perception. That when you cleanse the doors of perception, you're left with the only thing that's real, the infinite light. Something like that is his expression. And anyone who's ever dabbled or has a certain sense of beyond realizes that what we see in existence is only the surface level, the superficial, like the surface of the sea. You look at the surface of the sea and you had no clue, and you had no idea what's underneath it. Once in a while a fish jumps out here and there. Someone said to you, what's underneath? Most people would say, maybe 3-4 fish, nothing else, right? But today we know the systems under the sea are far more complex than the systems on land. Like the Talmud stated long ago, every creature that exists on land, kol ma sheyesh biyabasha yesh biyam, everything that exists on land exists in the sea. It doesn't say the other way around, that everything in the sea exists on land, because there are far more creatures and species in the sea than there are on land. And the sea is 2/3 of the world, and the earth and land is only 1/3. Which is a symbol in Kabbalistic terminology for the hidden worlds and for the revealed worlds. Psychologically speaking, the unconscious, which is the sea within us, is 2/3 of our being. And the land, the conscious, is 1/3. You can't necessarily quantify it in numbers that way, but it means the majority of the forces that shape you are invisible to you and to anyone around you. They're unconscious. That's why they're called unconscious. The conscious, what we see is very little. We see the surface. What shapes you? Why you have certain attitudes? Why do you get angry when someone else doesn't get angry in the same situation? Why do you have more confidence, less confidence? Most of us are not aware of the unconscious forces that shape us. This includes our childhood, our upbringing, maybe our genes, all the different factors. What Ayin Beis does is helps us access that unconscious by understanding the forces behind the cloaks. So our lives are defined by veils. Everything is a veil. When you walk out of your house, how does the line go in this song? Everybody's got a jar near their door, different faces, masks we put on before we go out. And you have different masks, different people you meet, you put on a different face, right? You don't even have to think about it. The people you like, the people you're more comfortable with, is one face. The people you're less comfortable with, the strangers, we've got our faces. We've got everything worked out. When we meet our mother, we meet our father, everybody's got how you respond. It's like built-in, knee-jerk reaction almost. The problem is when you become your mask. That's the problem. That everybody has masks and veils and layers. That's a given. We protect ourselves. We have our defense mechanisms. The problem is if you become your defense mechanism, then we got trouble. Because not only have you lost yourself, you've now become something you're not even. You've become your projection. You've become the image that you are trying to project. So the idea of veils and understanding these cloaks and these layers and all these shrouds, curtains, all these are, by the way, names in Kabbalistic terminology, different layers of blockers, are all about understanding how do you get beneath the surface. So when two people meet and they become friends, what's happening? When they met, there were many layers, and friendship means there are less layers, to put it in clinical terminology, so to speak. And the closer you get with someone, the less layers there are. So really this is about a process of growth, and as well as one with yourself. Do you know yourself? It's sometimes good to be your own best friend. But first you have to know yourself to be your best friend. Like someone told me, I suggested to someone, maybe you should become your own best friend. The person said, I don't even know who I am. I don't even know if I like myself. Why would I be my own best friend? So I said, well, maybe time to start, because you can't get rid of yourself, so you might as well become friends with yourself. So it's about learning how to become self-aware. So how does one begin? Well, the Laban and Jacob story, you got to get the mounds down. You can't build a mound. You can't build a mountain. You have to be, you can't build impenetrable barriers, because then no one can get in and nothing can get out. Many people build such sophisticated defense systems and such armor, such thick armor, that there's no relationship possible. And I can understand why. They say, how natural pearls are made, right? A natural pearl in an oyster is actually a secretion of liquid as a result of irritation. So next time you see pearls, you can know it's a result of someone got an irritated oyster. Oysters have very, very sensitive skin, their insides, and a very sensitive membrane. When there's a piece of dust that falls on that membrane, it's like a piece of dust on your eye. What do? So we, either we try to get it out, or the secretions of our tear ducts get rid of it. An oyster also cries. It secretes liquid, and that liquid solidifies around the piece of dust, and that's what a pearl is. Check it out. It's not my imagination. Which is interesting. It means the sensitivity of the oyster to some little irritant is what brings what we call pearls, beautiful pearls. So how many other beautiful pearls out there that are all a birth of pain, out of pain? The point I'm making here is that often when we are hurt in relationships, we build up armor to protect ourselves. And the more sensitive you are, and the more you've been hurt, usually you put up very heavy armor. And often I will hear someone says to me, I will not have children. Because I was a child, I was hurt. I don't want to hurt children. Others, I will not go into a serious relationship because I was in a relationship and I was betrayed. This list goes on. And of course, it's really sad to hear. I'm not here to challenge someone. I know where they're coming from, but I always say to them, so what are you doing? You're writing yourself off because you were hurt. Why don't you learn to do it the right way? But when you're hurt, what happens is you build up walls. And then you become trapped in your own walls. Other people will say, I have no problem with the relationship. Let the other person be vulnerable. I will not be vulnerable. So what exactly do you want exactly? So people want to build up a wall and not let anybody in. But when you don't let anybody in, you also don't let anyone out. It's like building a walled city and there's no gates. You have to remember, yes, no gates means no enemy can get in, but no gates means you also can't get out. So then you become a hostage of your own fears. So essentially what the key here is, Laban built a mound. His fear, his insecurity, however you want to define it, did not want to engage with something that was on a Jacob level. And Jacob had the confidence and understood, because he was a man of God. It wasn't because he happened to be a more confident person. He understood, I am valuable and I have my power because God blessed me. And as a result, he had the confidence, we don't have to build. We'll build a boundary, but we don't have to build an impenetrable armor. Impenetrable armor is always a sign of death. Because things need to breathe for them to be healthy. Somebody locks themselves up physically, it's not healthy. You keep breathing the same stale air. And psychologically, if you lock yourself up, it's not healthy. Because you're never experiencing anything else except your own thoughts. So the idea of being challenged, the idea of engaging in new experiences, trying something different, meeting a new friend, going to an event where you know nobody, these things are very healthy forces. They're terrifying sometimes to a person who's insecure or fearful or who's been hurt. But the key is to find the right balance and to find the right way to breathe fresh air. Doesn't mean you have to completely break down all the boundaries, but to have healthy boundaries and healthy balance. So to conclude where I began, Thanksgiving, appreciating other people, appreciating yourself, other people appreciating you, is all predicated on the one principle of how confident and secure you are. If you appreciate yourself, number one, you're less dependent on other people's appreciation, but generally you also project positive energy. And sometimes it's important to look at, your ability to help to appreciate others, which is always a result if you're confident, secure person. If you're confident, secure, you're more sensitive to those around you. So the Laban and Jacob battle is very much the battle between self-absorption, to be totally trapped in your cloaks and in your behind the mountains and mounds, and Jacob being the man of spirit, a spirit which is focusing on something beyond yourself. So on this Thanksgiving and in general in our lives, acknowledging the blessings and gifts that are beyond us is very much the key to allowing in fresh air. On a practical level, it means maybe it's time to meet a new friend. I always ask people the question, when you go to a party, who do you gravitate to? New people or people you know? And it's interesting how people respond to this. Some people always will gravitate to people they know, because that's comfortable. I'm not saying it's bad per se, but it tells you something. And then there are those that don't want to see people they know. They want to always meet new people. Now, I'm not suggesting it's extremes. You want to have a balance of both. Total extrovert and total introvert are not healthy. You need a balance. There's a time, like Hillel says, if I'm not for myself, who will be for me? But if I'm only for myself, mani, what am I? And to find that balance, that dance, as I said, two circles, where they become one, like links in a chain, or like musical notes in a composition, or like chapters in a book, that's the key. Or to conclude with Rabbi, the Kotzker Rebbe's line that I've often cite. He says, if I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I will not be and you are not. I am not and you are not. But if I am I because I am I, and you are you because you are you, I am and you are. Beyond the poetic side of it, it means that if my identity is defined not by self-generated identity, but by proximity by others, and your identity is defined by others, by me, then who am I? Who am I? We're both, it's like the blind leading the blind. And identity has to emerge from within. And we have it within us. Sometimes it's trapped. And the key is to find ways to free it. One of the basic ways is when you learn about these things, when you talk about it. Don't ever underestimate the power of breaking the silence. Even discussing it is already a freeing thing. Because you suddenly realize there's other possibilities. Many people don't like to talk about this topic because it's very uncomfortable. This topic, how secure are you, how fearful, how much you appreciate. This idea of acknowledging, are you really secure with who you are, or are you dependent on other people's opinions, etc., etc. But talking about it with people you can trust in environments that are trusting is a very healthy way of building up such confidence. And as usual, when you're around people that are confident, it makes you more confident. They tell that story with the paratrooper, or the potential paratrooper, I should say. So he wanted to become a paratrooper, so he joined the Army, the Air Force. And in order to get training, what you do is you go up in the plane with the other paratroopers, and you watch them. You watch them, and you build up the methodology, and you build up the confidence. It's not so easy to jump out of a plane. After a month of training, this guy is told by the commander, okay, your turn. So he packs up, he's all excited, he lines up, and as everybody jumps out, now it's yours. He looks down, he gives a look, he suddenly runs to the other side. No, I can't jump. Now, of course, this happens from every 1 out of 10. So, okay, another few weeks of training, you'll watch and you'll build up more confidence and courage. Fine, a few more weeks pass, now your turn. Again, he comes, he looks down. No. So the commander says, listen, clearly you're not going to become a paratrooper. I think you should join another part of the military. This is not for you. You don't have it made. So he said, no, I want to stay here. She said, but you're never going to jump. He says, I know I'm never going to jump, but I like to be around people who jump. So there's 3 types of people. People who have the courage, people who like to be around courageous people, and then people who just don't show up. Or like we like to say in journalism, they say there are people who make things happen, and people who watch things happen, and people who ask what happened. So we Jews have always made things happen, hopefully for the good. So I bless you all, those of you here, and those in cyberspace, wherever you may be, with a very confident week and a confident life, I should say. A week is not enough. And to realize that you have in you much more than you think you have, And it's about time to find people that have that confidence in you and bring out the best in you. And with that, everyone should have a happy Thanksgiving and a happy holiday season. And we shall continue this journey next week, next Wednesday. And please leave us your email address or contact us at meaningfullife.com. And what else should I announce? Philip will not give a class to he's having turkey. Okay. I was thinking of connecting this to Turkey, but I couldn't find a connection. So there's no connection for now. Anyway, but we will be back next Wednesday night. I should also announce, if you've gotten the email, we've joined this, it's something that could help us and help everyone. This American Express has this promotion on Saturday night for, they give you a $25 rebate for anything you charge. So it's an opportunity to make a donation or buy something. So we joined it as well. If you want to help us in that way, it costs you nothing. If you want to add something, if you want to make it cost you something, you could always add the 25. Anyway, I just wanted to announce that. And with that being said, everyone have a pleasant week. It should be a beautiful week. In Israel, we should experience only peace and peace among all people. For us, any life is a tragedy. Any life that's taken is a tragedy, and it should be a life of peace, a year of peace, and a world of peace. Thank you.